I always knew my parents favored my younger brother, but I didn't realize how deep it ran until the day they handed him the keys to his brand new condo while telling me, their eldest son, that I was a disappointment. That was the moment I decided I was done. I grew up in a house where love was conditional, tied to achievements, appearances, and whatever narrative my parents wanted to sell to the world. My father, a respected attorney, and my mother, a socialite who ran charity galas more than a home, had a very specific idea of success. It was sleek, effortless, and above all, worthy of boasting about at their high society functions. I didn't fit their mold. At 17, I landed my first job working back-breaking shifts in a dingy diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where the air smelled like burned grease. The customers ranged from drunk college kids to exhausted truckers, and the coffee was so bad it could strip paint off a wall. But it was a job, and I needed one because my parents had made it crystal clear. If you want to go to college, you better figure out how to pay for it. My younger brother, Luke, on the other hand, he didn't have to figure out anything. He was handed everything on a silver platter. When I was struggling through high school, balancing late-night shifts with morning classes, he was driving around in a brand-new Mustang, gifted to him for his 16th birthday. I still remember my mother's delighted laughter as she threw her arms around him, cooing about how he deserved something nice. Meanwhile, I had to buy my own used Toyota with the money I'd saved from wiping down greasy countertops and dealing with drunks who couldn't understand that we stopped serving breakfast afternoon. It wasn't just about money, though. It was about respect, about how they saw me versus how they saw him. Luke was the golden boy. He wasn't particularly smart or hardworking, but he had charm. He knew how to make people like him, how to tell our parents exactly what they wanted to hear. When he got an A on a history exam, my mother acted like he'd won the Pulitzer Prize. When I made the dean's list while working 40 hours a week, my father barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's what you're supposed to do," he said flatly. No need for applause. I swallowed my bitterness and pushed forward. I saved every penny, paid my own way into college, and kept working through every semester. I was exhausted, burned out, but determined. I thought, maybe if I proved myself, if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, they'd finally see me. But that day never came. By the time I turned 23, I was nearly done with my business degree, still working 2 jobs, and renting a shoebox-sized studio apartment in a part of town my mother referred to as unacceptable. Meanwhile, Luke was exploring his options, which meant partying through a communications degree my parents were funding in full. He barely showed up to class, spent most of his nights getting wasted, and still, they treated him like royalty. Then came the moment that changed everything. I had just finished a brutal double shift at the diner, my hands raw from scrubbing grease traps, when my father called. "Come by the house," he said. "We have some exciting news." Exciting news. Right. I should have known better than to think it had anything to do with me. When I arrived, the whole family was gathered in the living room. My mother, practically glowing with excitement, my father with that rare, satisfied smirk, and Luke, sprawled out on the couch like a king holding court. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing myself. My mother turned to Luke and handed him a sleek envelope. With an exaggerated yawn, he pulled out a set of keys and jingled them in front of me. "They bought Luke a condo near campus," my mother announced, as if revealing a royal decree. I stared. I must have misheard. "They've bought you a condo?" I repeated. Luke smirked. "Yeah, man. It's just a little place, you know? Dad didn't want me wasting money on rent." Wasting money on rent. My stomach twisted as I thought about my own reality, how I spent nights studying in my freezing apartment because I couldn't afford to turn the heat up. How I rationed groceries at the end of the month, making sure my last $10 stretched as far as possible. How every cent I made went into tuition, rent, and basic survival. I turned to my father. "You never offered to help me with rent." He didn't even flinch. "You never asked." I let out a bitter laugh. "I never asked because you made it clear I was on my own." My mother's face hardened. "Don't make this about you, Nathan. This is a big step for Luke. You should be happy for your brother." Happy. Right. I should be happy that my freeloading, drunk driving, college flunking brother just got handed real estate while I was barely holding my life together. Luke grinned and clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't be salty, bro. Hard work builds character." Something inside me snapped. I yanked his hand off my shoulder and took a step back. "You think this is about character?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You have no idea what hard work even looks like, Luke. You've never had to struggle for anything in your life." My father stood up, his face darkening. "Watch your tone." "No," I shot back. I've watched my tone for years. I've played by your rules. I've worked my ass off. And I've done everything on my own while you've been over backward for him. I pointed at Luke, who was suddenly looking less amused. And what do I get for it? You sit there and tell me I'm a disappointment while buying him a damn condo? That's enough, my father barked. I clenched my fists. No, I'm done. Silence stretched between us. I could see my mother was about to launch into one of her guilt-tripping speeches, but I wasn't going to let her. You want to know the real difference between me and Luke? I said, my voice steady. I don't need you. And from this moment on, I don't want anything to do with you. I turned on my heel and walked out, slamming the door behind me. They didn't come after me. They didn't call. They didn't care. But what they didn't know, what I didn't even know yet, was that the next time they saw me, they would be the ones begging, and I would have the power to say no. I didn't look back when I walked out of my parents' house that night. The air was cold, sharp enough to cut, but I barely felt it as I climbed into my car. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, not from fear or sadness, but from the kind of anger that settles deep in your bones, the kind that doesn't go away with time. I drove aimlessly for a while, my mind racing. There was a weight in my chest, but beneath it, something else stirred. A clarity. A resolve. They had never been on my side. And now, I didn't have to be on theirs. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, if you could even call it that. The place was one step above condemned, with flickering hallway lights and neighbors who fought so loudly through the walls that I knew their entire relationship history. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I collapsed onto my mattress, the same one I'd hauled in when I first moved out, worn and sagging from years of use. The apartment was cold. My heating bill had gone unpaid for 2 weeks, and I was hoping to scrape together enough from my next paycheck to turn it back on. Meanwhile, Luke was probably stretching out on his brand new couch, admiring the view from his balcony. I stared at the ceiling. No more. I wasn't going to be the afterthought anymore. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself to parents who were never going to see me. I had sacrificed sleep, health, and any chance at a normal college experience just to survive. And for what? They had never respected me. So why the hell was I still playing their game? That night, I made a decision. I was done scraping by. I was going to succeed. And not just in the way they wanted, but on my own terms. I was going to build something so unshakable that the next time they looked at me, they would regret every single moment they had overlooked me. But first, I needed a plan. The next morning, I dragged myself out of bed before dawn. My first shift at the warehouse started at 6, and my body was already protesting. I had barely slept. At work, I went through the motions, lifting, moving, stacking, but my mind was somewhere else. I wasn't just working anymore. I was watching. I started paying attention to everything. How the managers talked. How decisions were made. Where the money flowed. I had spent my whole life being the grunt. The one clocking in, clocking out, breaking my back for a paycheck that barely kept me afloat. But what if I wasn't the grunt anymore? What if I was the one calling the shots? I spent my breaks in the corner of the break room, scrolling through articles about business, finance, and investing. I didn't have the luxury of a trust fund like Luke, but I could be smarter with what little I had. I cut out everything unnecessary, no more takeout, no more treat-yourself moments. Every extra dollar went straight into savings. And then, one night, as I was collapsing into bed after a 16-hour shift, my phone buzzed. A message from an old friend. Hey man, heard you were still in town. Listen, my startup's hiring. It's nothing fancy, just some entry-level work, but the pay's better than a warehouse gig. You in? I stared at the screen. A way out. I didn't hesitate. I'm in. The next few months were brutal. I worked at the startup by day and the warehouse by night. My body was running on caffeine and sheer willpower, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually moving forward. The startup wasn't glamorous. The office was in a dingy building downtown, and my job was basically just crunching numbers and handling grunt work. But I didn't care. Because I was learning. I watched how deals were made. I studied the way investors talked. I asked questions that made people raise their eyebrows, but I didn't stop. By the time a year had passed, I had climbed the ranks. I was no longer just a grunt. I was running numbers for million-dollar deals. I was in meetings with people who made decisions that shifted entire markets. And then, one day, the CEO pulled me aside. You've got a sharp mind, he said. You ever thought about starting something of your own? The question made something in me pause. I had spent my whole life working for people, taking orders, scrambling just to survive. But what if I wasn't meant to work for someone? What if I was meant to be the someone? That night, I pulled out my laptop and started drafting ideas. I didn't have Luke's luxury of failing without consequences. But I had something better. I had fire. 2 years later, I was standing in the middle of my own office. Not rented. Not borrowed. Owned. I had built my own business, an analytics firm that took off faster than I could have imagined. I had poured everything into it, every sleepless night, every dollar, every ounce of willpower. And it had worked. My company wasn't massive, but it was profitable. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. I had a team working under me. I had investments that were growing. I had built a life that was mine. And then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. But something in me knew. It was my mother. Her voice was different. Tired. Worn. "Nathan," she said, and for the first time in years, she sounded hesitant. We need to talk." It turned out that while I had been building something, my parents had been losing everything. Luke, their golden child, had run through their money like water. The condo? Sold at a loss. The career they had assumed he'd walk into? Never materialized. And now, they were drowning. They needed me. The son they had ignored. The son they had dismissed. The son they had called a disappointment. My father, the man who had once told me that I wasn't working hard enough, now needed my money to save their home. And Luke? He wasn't smirking anymore. He was desperate. "We just need a little help," my father said. "Just until we get back on our feet." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window of my own office. For the first time in my life, I had the power. I could save them. But the question was, did they deserve it? I let the silence stretch. On the other end of the line, my father cleared his throat. My mother murmured something, probably urging him to say more. But what was left to say? They needed me. The kid they never invested in. The son they dismissed as a background character in their golden child's life. I should have felt satisfaction. Maybe even a little joy at the irony of it all. But mostly, I just felt nothing. "How much?" I finally asked, keeping my voice unreadable. There was an audible sigh of relief from my mother. "We don't need much," she said quickly. "Just enough to cover a few missed payments. The bank is threatening foreclosure, but if we can just catch up." "How much?" I repeated, sharper this time. A beat of hesitation. Then my father's voice, gruff, forced, $20,000. I nearly laughed. 20 grand. They really thought I was just sitting on stacks of cash, waiting to throw it at their feet. I had money, more than I ever imagined I'd have at this stage in my life, but not because of them. Because of me. Because I had clawed my way up, one brutal shift at a time, one sleepless night after another. I had sacrificed everything to get here. And they had spent years telling me I wasn't good enough. Now, here they were, voices heavy with expectation, as if I owed them something. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You need 20 grand because Luke ran through your savings, trashed the condo you bought him, and now you're out of options?" My father bristled. "That's not it. Don't lie to me." Silence. Then my mother, ever the peacemaker, tried a different angle. "Nathan, sweetheart, this is family. We help each other. It's what we do." I let out a slow breath. "No, that's what I did. What I always did. I worked my ass off while you funneled everything into Luke. I got nothing. No help. No support. Just lectures about how I wasn't doing enough, even when I was killing myself trying to survive. And now that the roles are reversed, you expect me to jump in and save you." "We made mistakes," my mother said quickly, her voice shaking. "We didn't see." "You chose not to see," I cut in. "You chose to favor him. You chose to invest everything in a kid who never worked for anything. And now you're paying the price for those choices." A sharp inhale on the other end of the line. My father, the man who never once apologized for anything, finally muttered, "We know we messed up." I let that sit for a moment. It wasn't enough. I wasn't some bitter teenager anymore, begging for their approval. I was a grown man, a successful one. And I had learned, through years of suffering, that some things can't be undone with an apology. They had made their bed. Now they had to lie in it. "Look," I said finally, "I'm not heartless. I'm not going to watch you lose your house. But I'm not handing over 20 grand just so you can bail Luke out again. Nathan." "I'll cover 3 months of your mortgage directly," I said, cutting them off. "That's it. After that, you're on your own. And don't you dare give a single cent of it to Luke." A long silence. Then, my father exhaled, slow and heavy. "Fine." My mother's voice was softer. "Thank you, Nathan. Really. I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for me. Because no matter how much I had moved on, some small part of me, the part that still remembered coming home exhausted to a house where I was invisible, needed to see this through. To see them struggle. To know that, for the first time in their lives, they needed me more than I needed them. The next time I saw them in person, everything had changed. Gone was the arrogance, the untouchable certainty that had ruled their lives for so long. My father had lines in his face I didn't remember. My mother, always impeccably put together, looked tired in a way makeup couldn't hide. They had been humbled. Luke was nowhere to be seen. "Where's your son?" I asked, voice flat. My father stiffened. "He's staying with a friend for now." I almost smirked. Figures. Luke had spent his whole life coasting on their generosity, and the second things got difficult, he bailed. Just like I knew he would. They spent the next hour making small talk, avoiding the real conversation. It wasn't until I was getting ready to leave that my mother finally broke. "I regret it, you know," she said quietly. I turned to face her. "Regret what?" She swallowed. "How we treated you. I see it now. I wish it didn't take losing everything for us to realize it." For a long time, I had imagined hearing those words. I had thought they would bring closure, some deep, satisfying relief. But as I looked at her, I realized something. I didn't need their apology. Because I had already moved on. Because I had already won. So I just nodded. "Me too." Then I walked out the door, leaving my past behind. And I never looked back.